Hey, welcome back. So before we move on to another category of DAX functions, there's one more time intelligence function I'd like to introduce you to. Dates in period. So instead of year-to-date totals or month-over-month comparisons, dates in period gives us a way to introduce rolling totals, like, for example, the last 30 days or the last 6 months, and even moving averages to our pivots. Good luck accomplishing that in a conventional pivot table without DAX. So as you see here in our example file, we have a metric called revenue rolling 3-month total, which adds up for each given month of the pivot the revenue for the last 3 months. So if we look at the rolling 3-month total for the month of September in 2018, we see that number is around 600,000. And then if we add the totals for September, August, and July, going back 3 months, in the revenue column, they add up to the exact same number. Even cooler to me is our 3-month moving average column, which instead of producing the total revenue of the last 3 months, instead gives us the average. So we see again for September of 2018, that 3-month moving average per our measure is $200,168. And then if we look at the average of July, August, and September, sure enough, that average is the exact same. Now, creating moving averages like this in a pivot table may sound daunting, but the dates and period function makes it surprisingly straightforward. So let's see how. Now to get us started, I'll create a simple pivot with year and month on rows and revenue on values. And now I'm going to use that dates and period function to create a measure showing a rolling 3-month total, which for any given month in our pivot will reflect the total of that month plus the prior 2 months for a rolling 3-month total. So it turns out that dates in period works a lot like dates year to date, which we used a couple videos ago. But instead of extending the filter context back to the beginning of some interval, for example, the current month or the current year, it instead extends filter context forward or backward by a custom amount that we specify. Now, while we can also customize the date we extend the filter context from, for most applications, you'll just want that to be the most recent or max date in the current pivot table filter context. Which is to say, if we're in a row of the pivot where the year is, for example, November 2018, the max date for that particular filter context is November 30th, 2018. Once we have that max date, the dates and period function expands the filter context forward or backward from that date, a specified number of a specified type of date interval, perhaps 2 months ago, or 1 year ago, or even 30 days ago. This is how we achieve rolling totals based on the date value of a particular address in our pivot. So now that we get the general concept behind the dates and period function, let's see what the syntax looks like. So I'll go to our Power Pivot tab and then create a new measure. And I'll call this one revenue rolling 3-month total. And then for our formula, as usual, I'll start with a calculate function. And then our expression will be revenue. And then for our filter, I'll now invoke that dates and period function. And as usual for time intelligence functions, our first argument will just be the dates column of our calendar table. And now the second argument is the date from which we are counting a certain number of intervals forward or backward. And again, typically this is going to be the maximum date, the most recent date in the current coordinates of the pivot table. So if we're in the cell of the pivot table for November of 2018, the max date that we would typically want to key off of is November 30th, 2018. and we can get that by just applying a max function to the date column from the calendar table. Now for our third argument, much like with the date add function, we just need to specify the number of intervals that we want to offset from this max date we're using as our starting point. And in this case, we're producing a rolling 3-month total, so that's 3 months in the past, so we'll use -3. And then for our interval, as you might have guessed, we'll just use month. And then we'll close out our parentheses, and then format this as currency since it's just a filtered version of the revenue measure, and click OK. And now we'll add this to our pivot. Okay, so far so good. Spot checking these numbers, they look reasonable. So if I just pick a month at random, say April of 2019, we see our rolling 3-month total is 747,000. And then if I add up the numbers for February, March, and April, it looks like that's the total we get. Now taking this to the next level, where instead of a rolling 3-month total, we produce a 3-month moving average, is surprisingly easy. In fact, it's as easy as dividing our rolling 3-month total by 3. So let's create another measure called revenue 3-month moving average that simply divides this measure by 3. So I'll create a new measure and assign it to the order details table, and I'll call it revenue 3-month moving average. And then I'll use the divide function to divide our revenue rolling 3-month total by 3. And then I'll format as currency and click OK. And now spot checking a different month, let's say July of 2019, my 3-month rolling average is 302,694. So if I select May, June, and July, and then look at the auto-populated averages down in my status bar, we get 302,694. So it looks like our 3-month moving average measure is working as well. But there are a couple things we probably want to clean up before we'd want to present this file to an end user. For example, if we scroll back to the top, we see that our 3-month moving average measure is producing some deceptive and counterintuitive results for the first couple months of our data. That's because we're literally just taking the rolling 3-month total and dividing it by 3. So in the first month, where our rolling 3-month total consists of just a single month, we're basically just dividing 1 month's revenue by 3. So we end up with a number, $40,000, which, while it may be technically accurate, would also be confusing to a lot of end users and just doesn't add a lot of value in telling the story of our data. So really, the first number in our 3-month moving average column that really makes sense is this third one here, because that's the first number where we have data 2 months prior, for a total of 3 months to average. So what we need is a test to check whether there is revenue 2 months prior to the current cell in the pivot. Now that's quite a bit of logic to try to bake into this measure, so I'm going to create another measure called revenue 2 months prior, and then I can use the output of that to determine whether I want to return a blank or a value from our 3-month moving average measure. So back up to our measures button, I'll call our measure revenue 2 months prior. And now I'm going to use the date add function we saw in the last video to pull in the revenue measure 2 months prior to the current month in the pivot. So first the calculate function, and then the revenue measure will be the first argument, and then we'll use the date add function as our filter, with the dates column being the first argument of that function, and then we're going backwards 2 months, so -2 for number of intervals, and then month is of course the interval. So now we'll close out our parenthesis, check formula, format as currency, and click OK. And just as we'd expect, this revenue 2 months prior measure is returning blanks for those first 2 months of our data. because for those 2 months, there was no revenue 2 months prior. So now that we have this measure, we can use it as the basis of our logical test in our 3-month moving average measure. So we'll go back into that measure and edit it. So we'll select it, click Edit, and now we'll use our good friend is blank. So we'll say if is blank, and now we'll pass in our revenue 2 months prior measure. And then if that is blank, we'll return a blank. And then if not, we'll return our 3-month moving average measure. So now we'll check formula and click OK. And there we are. We got rid of those nonsensical values in our 3-month moving average measure. And at this point, we don't even need our revenue 2 months prior measure, so we can remove that from our pivot. And now, just to make sure this report is ready for presentation, let's scroll to the bottom and see if we have any issues. And kind of similar to our last 2 time intelligence functions, our new measures are returning values for months where the underlying measure, that being revenue, doesn't even have data. And again, that's because in the case of our rolling 3 months revenue measure, it is valid to say that in September, even though we don't have data for that month, that there is such a thing as a rolling 3-month value, because we still have values to add for July and August. So what we need to do here, much as we did with our previous time intelligence functions, is add one more condition that says, if the revenue measure is blank, return a blank. So that will require us to edit our rolling 3-month measure. So we'll go back into our Manage Measures, and then select that measure and edit. And then we'll say if is blank revenue, return a blank, otherwise return the result of our measure. And then we'll add one more parenthesis for our if function, and then check formula, and then click OK. And now, as you can see, those 2 unnecessary rows in our pivot that showed rolling 3-month totals, even though we didn't even have revenue for those months, are gone. Okay. So up to this point, we've focused mainly on how we can solve various kinds of data problems with measures and DAX formulas. And that's totally okay. But we haven't given much attention to the how of writing DAX formulas. That is to say, best practices for writing these formulas in a readable, maintainable way that introduces the least amount of virtual clutter into our measures. So in the next video, we'll focus on one of the most foundational and useful optimization techniques in DAX: variables. I'll see you then.